The thunder came before the rain that night, rolling across the Georgia hills like war drums from another age. May had turned cruel that year, the kind of cruel that makes men forget mercy and remember only greed. The dogwoods had bloomed white as bone along the Etowah River, their petals falling like ash over land that no longer belonged to those who'd bled for it. Chief Tyanita stood at the edge of his camp, watching the horizon darken. He was 43 years old, though his face carried the weight of centuries. The removal orders had come down from Washington 3 months prior. Every Cherokee man, woman, and child was to leave Georgia, to march west toward lands they'd never seen, through a journey already being called the Trail Where They Cried. His people were being rounded up like cattle, herded into stockades, their homes burned behind them so they'd have nothing to return to. But Tyanita had not moved. He would not move. His village was gone now, the cabins reduced to charred frames, the council house nothing but memory and smoke. 23 families had been taken at gunpoint, led away in chains while soldiers laughed about the bounty money. His wife had died 2 winters before, buried in soil his ancestors had tended for 10,000 seasons. His son had gone west with the first removal, hoping to prepare a place for those who followed. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Tyanita had stayed behind with 11 warriors who shared his conviction. If they were to die, let it be here, where their fathers' fathers rested, where the stones knew their names. They lived now like ghosts in their own country, moving through forests that white men feared to enter, hunting deer that somehow still thrived despite the chaos, fishing waters that ran clear and cold even as the world burned around them. The soldiers came sometimes, tracking them through the pines, but the forest was dense, and the Cherokee knew every hidden path, every cave, every bend in the river where a man could vanish like morning mist. Tonight, though, something felt different. The air itself seemed to vibrate with warning. Tyanita's lieutenant, a lean warrior named Sequoia, approached from the tree line. His face was grave. There are riders on the southern road, 12 men. They have dogs. Soldiers? No, patrollers. Slave catchers! Sequoia spat the words like poison. They're heading toward the river bend. Tyanita's jaw tightened. The slave patrols were worse than soldiers, mercenaries paid by plantation owners to hunt down escaped slaves, authorized to kill if necessary, immune from prosecution. They were men who'd found a way to profit from cruelty, who'd turned human suffering into sport. He'd encountered them before, watched from the shadows as they dragged terrified people back to bondage, their screams echoing through the forest. "Let them pass," Tyanita said quietly. "This is not our war." But even as he spoke, he knew it was a lie. Every war was their war now. Every act of violence on this land was an act against the land itself, against everything his people had tried to protect. Sequoia nodded but didn't move. "There's something else. The dogs picked up a scent 2 hours ago. The patrollers are tracking someone, maybe more than one." Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the camp in stark white relief. 5 shelters made of hide and branch, a small fire burning low, weapons stacked carefully against the trees. This was all that remained of a nation that had once stretched from the mountains to the sea. "How many are they hunting?" Tyanita asked. "Unknown. But the patrollers are excited. I heard them talking when I got close. They said something about a big catch, about bounty money that would set them up for the season." Tyanita closed his eyes. He could hear it now, faint but distinct, the baying of hounds in the distance, that horrible sound that meant someone was running for their life. The rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, drumming against the leaves overhead. "Gather the others," he said, quietly. Within minutes, all 11 warriors had assembled. They moved like shadows, making no sound, their faces painted with charcoal and red clay, their weapons sharp and ready. These were men who'd chosen death over exile, who'd decided that if their nation was to end, it would end with honor, not with a whimper of compliance. Tyanita addressed them in Cherokee, his voice low and steady. "Brothers, there are slave catchers in our forest tonight. They hunt human beings as if they were animals. This land has seen enough blood, enough cruelty. I do not ask you to fight. This is not our battle in the way our fathers knew battle. But I cannot stand silent while murder happens in the shadow of our ancestors' graves." The youngest warrior, barely 20, named Wire, spoke up. "What would you have us do? Follow, watch. If they pass through peacefully, we let them go. But if they mean to kill tonight—" Tyanita let the sentence hang in the air. "Then we remind them whose land this was, and whose land it will always be." They moved out in pairs, spreading through the forest in a wide arc, tracking the patrollers by sound and instinct. The rain was coming down hard now, turning the ground to mud, making everything slick and treacherous. Perfect cover. The storm would hide their approach, mask their footsteps, turn them into elements of the forest itself. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, Sequa raised his hand, the signal to stop. Through the trees ahead, firelight flickered. The patrollers had made camp in a clearing near the river, a temporary shelter from the storm. Their horses were tied to a low branch, their dogs chained and restless, sensing something in the darkness that their masters could not. Tyanita crept closer, staying low until he could see clearly. 12 white men sat around the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey, their rifles stacked carelessly nearby. They were laughing, telling stories, completely confident in their safety. Why wouldn't they be? This was their country now, their law, their world. They owned everything, including, they believed, the right to decide who lived and who died. But it was what Tyanita saw beyond the fire that made his blood turn cold. 5 figures huddled against a massive oak tree, bound together with rope, their clothes torn and muddy, their faces etched with exhaustion and terror. 3 men, 1 woman, 1 boy, who couldn't have been more than 15. Slaves. Runaways. People who'd risked everything for a chance at freedom, only to be caught, only to face a fate worse than death. One of the patrollers stood up, walked over to the prisoners, and kicked the nearest man in the ribs. "Tomorrow morning, we drag you back to the Harlan plantation. Old man Harlan's offering $200 per head. That's $1,000 for all of you. Best night's work we ever done." Another patroller laughed. "Hell, we should just shoot them here, say they tried to escape. Save ourselves the trouble of hauling them back." "Nah," the first man said. "Harlan wants them alive, wants to make an example. Public whipping, probably. Let the other slaves see what happens when you run." The woman began to cry, quiet, desperate sobs that carried across the clearing. The boy put his head down, shaking. Tyanita felt something ancient rise in his chest, something older than law, older than nations, older than the very concept of property. It was rage, yes, but also something purer, a recognition that some acts demanded response, that silence in the face of such cruelty was itself a form of evil. He turned to his warriors. Their faces reflected his own fury. "These men have come to our forest to practice murder," he said in Cherokee. "They have turned human beings into merchandise. They laugh while others weep. They think themselves beyond justice because their law protects them." He paused. "But they are not beyond the justice of this earth, of this land, of the spirits who watch over the innocent." Sequa gripped his tomahawk. "What are your orders?" Tyanita looked back at the camp, at the 12 men who thought themselves invincible, at the 5 souls who'd run toward hope only to find despair. "We show them that freedom is not theirs to sell," he said, "and we show them that there are still some who remember what justice truly means." The thunder rolled again, closer now, and the river seemed to roar its approval. The Cherokee warriors spread out through the darkness, becoming one with the storm, one with the ancient rage of the land itself. By dawn, the world would understand. Some ground is sacred, some cruelty cannot stand, and some men, when pushed too far, become the very vengeance that the earth demands. The patrollers never heard them coming. Tyanita had fought in wars before, against Creek raiders, against rival clans, even once against white settlers who tried to claim Cherokee hunting grounds. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was execution, justice delivered in the dark by men who no longer had anything to lose. The first patroller died without a sound. He'd wandered away from the fire to relieve himself, stumbling drunk into the tree line, whistling some tavern song. Wire took him from behind, one hand over the mouth, the blade across the throat so quick and clean that the man's body didn't even twitch. They dragged him deeper into the forest, left him face down in the mud where the rain would wash away the blood. 11 patrollers remained. Sequoia and 2 others approached the horses next. The animals were nervous, stamping and pulling at their tethers, sensing death in the air. The warriors moved among them like ghosts, cutting ropes, whispering calming words in Cherokee, until the horses stood still. Then, with sharp strikes, they drove the animals into the forest, scattering them in all directions. The patrollers would have no escape, no way to pursue, no way to outrun what was coming. Back at the fire, the white men were getting drunker, their laughter louder, their confidence absolute. One of them had produced a harmonica and was playing badly, the notes clashing with the thunder. Another was sharpening his knife against a whetstone, making long, deliberate strokes, occasionally glancing at the prisoners with a predator's smile. The woman had stopped crying. She stared into the fire with empty eyes, her spirit already broken. The boy beside her was shaking, whether from cold or fear, it was impossible to tell. The 3 men looked resigned, as if they'd known from the moment they ran that this was how it would end. Not with freedom, but with capture, humiliation, death, or something worse than death. Tyanita counted the remaining patrollers carefully. 11 men, all armed, most of them drunk but not helpless. His warriors were skilled, but they were also outnumbered and carrying weapons meant for hunting, not warfare. This would require precision, speed, and the kind of fury that made men fight beyond their limits. He caught Sequoia's eye across the clearing and gave the signal. The attack came from 3 sides at once. Sequoia emerged from the darkness behind the fire, his tomahawk already swinging, catching the harmonica player in the base of the skull before the man even knew danger was present. The patroller dropped like a stone, the harmonica falling from his lips, still wet with spit and cheap whiskey. 2 other warriors burst from the left, their war cries splitting the night, axes and knives flashing in the firelight. The patrollers scrambled for their rifles, but the weapons were stacked too far away, and panic made them clumsy. One man managed to grab a gun, but Wire was on him before he could aim, driving a knife up under his ribs, twisting, feeling the life leave the body in a hot rush of blood. Chaos erupted. One patroller ran for the tree line and met Tyanita's arrow in his chest, the impact lifting him off his feet, pinning him to an oak trunk where he hung like a grotesque ornament, mouth open in permanent surprise. Another tried to draw a pistol from his belt, but a thrown tomahawk split his forehead before his finger found the trigger. The remaining 6 patrollers formed a desperate circle, backs together, knives and clubs raised. They were screaming now, not battle cries, but pure terror, the sound of men who'd suddenly realized they weren't hunters anymore. They were prey. "Indians!" one of them shrieked. "We got Indians!" "Fight, you cowards!" another roared. "It's just a handful of savages." But they weren't fighting, they were dying. Tyanita moved like smoke through the clearing, his knife finding soft flesh again and again. These men had laughed while planning to torture 5 human beings. They'd kicked bound prisoners. They'd turned suffering into profit. He felt no mercy, only the cold satisfaction of removing poison from the earth. A patroller lunged at him with a club, swinging wild. Tyanita stepped inside the arc, caught the man's wrist, twisted until bones snapped, then drove his knife through the man's throat. Warm blood sprayed across his face, mixing with rain. He didn't flinch. Beside him, Sequa fought with terrible efficiency, his tomahawk rising and falling like a farmer's scythe at harvest, each blow precise, final. The youngest warrior, Wire, had abandoned his weapons entirely and was strangling a patroller with his bare hands, his face twisted with rage. Years of watching his people destroyed, finally finding an outlet. The leader of the patrol, a thick-necked man with a scar across his cheek, managed to break free from the circle. He ran toward the river, splashing through shallow water, screaming for help that would never come. Tyanita pursued him calmly, arrow nocked, bowstring drawn. The man made it perhaps 20 yards before the arrow took him through the back, punching through his shoulder blade and erupting from his chest in a spray of crimson. He fell face first into the Etowah, his blood swirling downstream, carried away by the same river that had carried away so much Cherokee blood over the years. Back at the camp, the last patroller stood alone, knife shaking in his hand, surrounded by Cherokee warriors. He was young, maybe 25, his face white with terror. He dropped the knife and raised his hands. "Please," he whispered, "please. I got a wife. I got children. I was just following orders. I didn't want to hurt nobody." Tyanita approached him slowly. The storm was beginning to pass now, the thunder moving east, the rain softening to a drizzle. Around them lay 11 bodies, the ground soaked red, the fire sputtering in the wet. "You chased 5 people through the forest," Tyanita said in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "You planned to drag them back to slavery, to torture them, to destroy them. And now you ask for mercy?" "I'm sorry," the man sobbed. "I'm sorry, I swear I am. I'll never do it again. I'll go away. I'll leave Georgia. You will leave," Tyanita agreed. "But not the way you think." He nodded to Sequa, who stepped forward and drove his knife into the man's heart. The patroller gasped once, twice, then collapsed, his plea for mercy dying on his lips. Silence fell over the clearing. 12 bodies now lay scattered among the trees, their blood feeding soil that had fed Cherokee people for generations beyond counting. The dogs had stopped barking. The horses were gone. Only the river spoke, eternal and indifferent. Tyanita walked to the oak tree where the 5 prisoners remained bound. They stared at him with eyes wide, uncertain whether they'd been saved or simply found new captors. The woman was trembling. The boy had wet himself. The men looked ready to bolt if given the chance. Tyanita cut their ropes with his bloody knife. "You are free," he said simply. The oldest of the 3 men, grey-haired with scars on his back visible through his torn shirt, shook his head slowly. "Free? Mister, we ain't never gonna be free. Not in Georgia, not nowhere in the South. They'll send more patrols. They'll hunt us till we're dead or back in chains." "Then you will go north," Tyanita said. "There are paths through the mountains that white men do not know, routes that lead to territories where slavery does not reach. It is a long journey. Many die trying, but some survive." The woman found her voice, hoarse and broken. "Why? Why did you help us? We ain't nothing to you." Tyanita looked at her for a long moment, then at the carnage surrounding them, then at the forest that had been his home since birth and would soon be his grave. "Because," he said quietly, "freedom is not theirs to sell, and because this land remembers. It remembers every drop of innocent blood spilled upon it. Tonight we gave the land what it was owed." Sequa and the other warriors were already moving through the clearing, scalping the dead patrollers with practiced efficiency. An old ritual, meant to send the spirits of enemies into the afterlife confused and powerless. They took the patrollers' weapons, gathered what supplies might be useful, and prepared to vanish back into the forest before dawn brought more danger. But Tyanita had one more task. He found the patrol's banner, a crude flag with the words Harlan Slave Patrol painted in black letters. He tore it in half, then used a knife to carve words into the oak tree in Cherokee script, letters his grandfather had taught him, symbols that carried the weight of a civilization older than the one trying to destroy it. The message was simple: freedom is not yours to sell. By the time the sun rose over the Etowah River, the clearing was empty, except for 12 mutilated corpses and a message carved in a language most white men would never understand. The 5 former slaves were miles away, guided by Cherokee warriors through secret paths, heading north toward uncertain freedom and away from certain death. And Chief Tyanita stood alone on a ridge overlooking the river, watching the dawn break over land that would never truly belong to those who'd stolen it. The governor would call it savagery. The newspapers would call it an outrage. The army would come looking for vengeance. But among the enslaved people of Georgia, a story was already spreading, whispered in quarters, sung in coded spirituals, passed from plantation to plantation like wildfire. The story of the Cherokee chief who'd massacred an entire slave patrol to save 5 people he'd never met. The story of the night the forest itself rose up in fury. The story of blood and justice and vengeance that the earth demanded. And though the world would soon forget Chief Tyanita's name, the land would remember, the river would remember, and somewhere in the north, 5 people who'd been given a second chance at life would remember. That was enough. The news reached the Harlan plantation 3 days later, carried by a trembling field hand who'd been sent to find out why the patrol hadn't returned. He'd found the clearing by following buzzards, great black birds circling over death, their shadows crossing the earth like prophecies. What he saw there would haunt him until his dying day. 12 bodies in various states of decomposition, bloated by heat, torn by animals, their scalps removed, their weapons destroyed. Blood had soaked into the ground so thoroughly that the earth itself looked diseased. And on the oak tree, carved deep into the bark, symbols he couldn't read but somehow understood, spoke of rage older than memory. He'd run all the way back to the plantation, arriving incoherent, speaking in fragments about massacres and ghosts and Indian vengeance. Master Harlan had struck him across the face for his hysteria, but when the white overseer rode out to investigate, he returned pale and silent, confirming every impossible detail. By sunset, riders were galloping toward Milledgeville, the state capital, carrying news that would ignite fury across Georgia. Colonel James Whitmore received the report in his office, a wood-paneled room adorned with maps of Cherokee territory and portraits of military heroes. He was 52 years old, a veteran of the Creek War, a man who'd built his career on removing Indians from valuable land. The removal of the Cherokee was his final campaign, his chance to secure a legacy as the man who'd civilized Georgia. He read the report twice, his jaw tightening with each sentence. 12 men, he said to his adjutant, a young lieutenant named Perkins. An entire patrol, massacred by savages who should have been marched west months ago. The field hand said there were Cherokee markings, sir, a message carved into a tree. What did it say? We don't know. None of our men read their language. Whitmore slammed his fist on the desk. Then find someone who does. I want to know exactly what kind of threat we're dealing with. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over Milledgeville's main street, watching citizens go about their evening business, unaware that the frontier they thought pacified was anything but. The Cherokee were supposed to be broken, defeated, herded into stockades like cattle awaiting slaughter. The fact that some had remained behind was troubling enough. The fact that they'd committed mass murder was unthinkable. How many Cherokee do we estimate are still in the territory? He asked. Intelligence suggests small bands scattered throughout the northern forests, sir. Maybe 200 individuals total. Most are elderly or infirm, those too weak to travel. The army assumed they'd die off naturally or surrender eventually. Clearly we assumed wrong. Whitmore turned back to face his adjutant. I want a company assembled immediately. 60 men, well-armed, experienced in forest warfare. We're going to find these savages and make an example that will echo through history. What about the runaway slaves, sir? The report mentioned 5 missing prisoners. Whitmore waved his hand dismissively. Secondary concern. If they survived, they're long gone by now. Our priority is the Indians. Every plantation owner in Georgia is going to panic when they hear about this. They'll demand action, protection, vengeance. He smiled coldly. And we'll give it to them. Lieutenant Perkins hesitated. Sir, the Cherokee who remained behind are reportedly non-combatants, women, children, the elderly. If we engage them aggressively, if they harbor warriors who murder white men, they're combatants, Whitmore interrupted. Don't mistake mercy for wisdom, Lieutenant. These people had their chance to leave peacefully. They refused. Now they'll learn what refusal costs. He returned to his desk and began drafting orders, his pen scratching across paper with military precision. By morning, 60 soldiers would be heading north, following the Etowah River, hunting for Cherokee who dared to resist. What Whitmore didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his orders were already too late. In the forest, Tyanita and his warriors were moving camp for the 3rd time in as many days. They knew the massacre would bring retaliation, knew that every soldier in Georgia would soon be hunting them. Staying in one place meant death. The 5 former slaves had left 4 days earlier, guided by 2 Cherokee scouts who knew the mountain passes, who could navigate by stars and streams and the flight patterns of birds. Tyanita had given them what little food could be spared, warned them about which towns to avoid, which rivers to follow, where sympathetic souls might offer shelter. "Will they make it?" Sequoia had asked after they'd vanished into the morning mist. "Some will," Tyanita had replied. "Maybe all, maybe none, but they have a chance now. That's more than they had 3 days ago." Now, as they broke down their temporary camp, scattering ashes, erasing footprints, leaving nothing that might reveal their numbers or direction, Tyanita felt the weight of what they'd done settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd killed before, every warrior had, but never like this, never with such cold deliberation. Never against men who'd been, by the white man's law at least, performing their legal duty. The older warriors seemed unbothered. To them, the patrollers had been no different than wolves attacking sheep, predators who'd met a natural end. But the younger ones, like Wire, were quiet, thoughtful, processing what it meant to have crossed a line from which there was no return. "They'll come for us now," Wire said, as they prepared to move out. "The soldiers, they'll hunt us until we're all dead." "They've been hunting us since the day we were born," Tyanita replied. "This changes nothing except that now they have a reason they can understand. We're no longer just obstacles to progress. We're criminals, murderers, and white men always feel righteous when hunting murderers." "Do you regret it?" Tyanita considered the question. Did he regret saving 5 lives? Did he regret punishing men who turned human beings into merchandise? Did he regret standing on sacred ground and defending it with sacred fury? "No," he said finally, "but I mourn what we've become. We were builders once, farmers, artisans, diplomats. We had laws, governments, schools. We weren't perfect, but we were civilized in ways these white men will never understand." He looked at the young warrior. "Now we're reduced to this. Hiding in our own forests, living like hunted animals, achieving victory only through murder in the dark. Is this what our ancestors dreamed for us?" Wire had no answer. They moved north, following game trails invisible to untrained eyes, crossing streams to hide their scent, traveling mostly at night when the forest belonged to those who knew its secrets. 3 times they spotted military patrols in the distance, lines of blue-coated soldiers marching in formation, completely unprepared for the terrain they were entering. The Cherokee watched them from ridgelines and behind thick brush, noting their numbers, their weapons, their tactical stupidity. "They march in straight lines," Sequoia observed with contempt, "like this is a battlefield in Virginia instead of Cherokee country." "Let them march," Tyanita said. The forest will exhaust them long before they find us. But on the fifth night, everything changed. One of the scouts returned to camp at a dead run, his face stricken. "Soldiers," he gasped. "But not just soldiers. They have Cherokee guides with them, men from the stockades who agreed to track us in exchange for better treatment." The words hit like a physical blow. Traitors. Their own people, desperate or broken or simply pragmatic, had agreed to help the white men hunt their brothers. "How many guides?" Tayanita demanded. "3. And they're good. They're following our trail correctly, reading the signs we thought we'd hidden." Tayanita felt a cold fury settling over him, different from the hot rage he'd felt at the slave patrol. This was deeper, colder, more terrible. To be hunted by enemies was one thing. To be hunted by your own people was betrayal beyond words. "How far behind are they?" "Maybe 2 hours. They're moving fast." Tayanita looked at his warriors, 11 men, all exhausted, all knowing that the chase was finally catching up to them. They could run, scatter into the forest individually, try to survive alone. But they'd been together for months now, brothers in resistance, the last free Cherokee in all of Georgia. To break apart felt like a final surrender. "We make a stand," Tayanita said quietly, "against 60 soldiers." Sequa looked skeptical. "That's suicide. Everything we've done has been suicide," Tayanita replied. "But we've done it on our terms, in our way. I'd rather die fighting than die running." He began issuing orders rapidly, decades of tactical knowledge coming to the fore. They would use the terrain, the darkness, every advantage the forest provided. Not to win, winning was impossible, but to make the cost of victory so high that the story would be told for generations. "We're not trying to kill all of them," he explained. "We're trying to kill enough that they remember, that they hesitate, that the next time white men consider hunting Cherokee, they think twice." The warriors moved into position, spreading out along a narrow canyon where the soldiers would have to pass, setting up ambush points in trees and behind rocks. They had perhaps 15 rifles taken from the patrol, limited ammunition, knives, tomahawks, and the intimate knowledge of land they'd walked since childhood. As the sun set and darkness claimed the forest, Tayanita climbed to a high point overlooking the canyon. From here he could see for miles the forests that had fed his people, the mountains that had sheltered them, the rivers that had given them life. It was beautiful. Even knowing he'd probably die in these woods within hours, he found it beautiful. Somewhere to the south, the 5 people he'd saved were still running, still hoping, still believing that freedom was possible. That was worth dying for. That single act of mercy in a world gone mad with cruelty that justified everything. He heard them before he saw them. The tramp of boots, the jingle of equipment, the low voices of men who thought themselves hunters, but were about to become prey, one final time. Tayanita nocked an arrow and waited. The last battle of the Free Cherokee was about to begin. The soldiers entered the canyon in double file, rifles held at the ready, moving with the cautious confidence of men who knew they outnumbered their enemy but had learned to respect the forest. At their head walked Lieutenant Perkins, young and nervous, constantly glancing at the Cherokee guides who moved ahead like bloodhounds on a scent. The guides troubled Tayanita more than the soldiers. He recognized one of them, a man named Kanuna, who'd been a respected hunter before the removal, who'd provided for his family with skill and honor. Now he walked with white men, pointing out broken branches and disturbed earth, trading his people's secrets for what? Better food, promises of lenient treatment, the illusion of control in a world that had stripped control from every Cherokee alive. Tayanita felt a profound sadness watching him. This was what conquest looked like in its final form, not just the destruction of a nation, but the corruption of its soul, the moment when survival became more important than principle. The soldiers were halfway through the canyon when Tayanita gave the signal. The first volley came from both sides simultaneously, rifle fire and arrows, erupting from the darkness, catching the column completely by surprise. 4 soldiers dropped immediately, including one of the Cherokee guides, killed by an arrow meant for the man beside him. The canyon erupted into chaos. "Ambush!" Lieutenant Perkins screamed, diving behind a boulder. "Return fire! Return fire!" But there was nothing to fire at. The Cherokee were invisible, shooting from concealed positions, using the darkness and terrain exactly as they'd planned. More soldiers fell, screaming, clutching wounds, while their comrades fired blindly into the trees, wasting ammunition on shadows. Colonel Whitmore, positioned near the rear of the column, began shouting orders. "Form defensive positions! Light torches! We need light!" As soldiers scrambled to obey, Tyanita and 3 warriors descended from their perches, moving among the chaos like death itself. Tyanita's tomahawk caught one soldier in the base of the skull, dropping him instantly. Beside him, Sequa gutted another with a knife, the man's scream cut short by a blade across his throat. The soldiers with torches became instant targets. Cherokee arrows found them within seconds, the lights winking out, plunging the canyon back into darkness. Men were firing in all directions now, some shooting their own comrades in the confusion, the discipline of the formation completely broken. "Fall back!" Whitmore roared. "Retreat to the south end!" But as the soldiers tried to withdraw, they discovered the Cherokee had blocked the rear exit with fallen logs and brush, turning the canyon into a killing box. Panic spread through the ranks. A young soldier, barely 18, stood frozen in the middle of the chaos, his rifle unfired, tears streaming down his face. Wire appeared behind him like a ghost, but instead of killing him, pushed him toward the rocks. "Hide," the young Cherokee said in English. "Be still, and you live." The soldier scrambled into the shadows, curling into a ball, sobbing. Not all the warriors were so merciful. Years of watching their people destroyed, their land stolen, their culture erased. All of it came pouring out in that canyon. Some soldiers begged for quarter and received none. Others fought to the end, taking Cherokee warriors with them. The canyon became a slaughterhouse, lit only by muzzle flashes and the occasional flicker of a dropped torch. Tyanita found himself face to face with Colonel Whitmore himself. The colonel had drawn his saber, standing his ground even as his command collapsed around him. He was older than Tyanita, grey-haired and weathered, but his eyes held the certainty of a man who'd never doubted his righteousness. "Savage!" Whitmore spat, raising his blade. "You'll hang for this. Every Cherokee in Georgia will hang." "No," Tyanita replied, his English clear despite his accent. "We will die, but we will die free." "Can you say the same, Colonel? Are you free, or are you a slave to hatred, to greed, to the belief that your people have the right to take everything?" They circled each other, weapons raised. Around them, the battle was winding down. Not because the Cherokee were winning, but because there were so few soldiers left to fight. "I was following orders," Whitmore said, "doing my duty." "So was I," Tyanita replied. "My duty to my ancestors. My duty to the land, my duty to those 5 souls who wanted only to live as human beings instead of property." He lunged forward, tomahawk swinging, but Whitmore was fast, blocking with his saber, the impact sending sparks into the darkness. They traded blows, neither gaining advantage, 2 old warriors fighting a war that neither had truly wanted, but neither could escape. Finally, Whitmore's boot caught on a rock. He stumbled, and Tyanita's tomahawk came down, catching him in the shoulder, driving him to his knees. The colonel gasped, blood spreading across his uniform, his sword clattering to the ground. Tyanita raised his weapon for the killing blow, but stopped. He looked at the man kneeling before him, this representative of everything that had destroyed his world, and felt only exhaustion. Killing him would change nothing. The Cherokee was still doomed. The land was still lost. Victory here was no victory at all. "Go," Tyanita said quietly. "Live with what you've done. Live with the knowledge that you destroyed a nation for nothing but soil and gold. Live with it until you die." He turned away, leaving Whitmore bleeding in the dirt. The battle was over. Of 60 soldiers, perhaps 20 remained, scattered through the canyon or fled into the forest. The Cherokee had lost 4 warriors, including Sequoia, who'd taken a bullet defending Wire and died with a smile on his face, finally at peace. But the victory felt hollow. They'd survived one more day. That was all. As dawn broke over the canyon, Tayanita gathered his remaining warriors, 7 men, all wounded, all exhausted, all knowing this was the beginning of the end. "We can't stay in Georgia," he said. "Too many soldiers, too much anger. We head west, try to find our people on the trail." "Oh, and if we can't find them?" Wire asked. "Then we keep going, into territories so remote that white men fear to follow. We survive however we can, for as long as we can." They left the canyon at sunrise, moving like ghosts through morning mist, leaving behind a scene that would shock Georgia to its core. 23 soldiers dead, including Cherokee guides who'd betrayed their own. Weapons scattered among the rocks. Blood soaking into earth that had seen too much blood already. And carved into a stone near the canyon entrance, fresh symbols in Cherokee script, "The land remembers." 300 miles north, the 5 former slaves were crossing into Tennessee, guided by 2 Cherokee scouts who taught them to move silently, to read the forest, to survive. The woman had stopped crying. The boy had found hope again. The 3 men walked with their heads up, tasting freedom for the first time in their lives. They would make it to Ohio by autumn, find communities that would shelter them, build lives that were truly theirs. Decades later, their grandchildren would tell stories about the Cherokee chief who'd saved their ancestors, who'd proven that humanity could transcend nation and race, that some men would risk everything for strangers simply because it was right. But they would never know the cost. Would never know that the warriors who'd guided them north were among the last free Cherokee to walk those mountains. Would never know about the canyon battle, the desperate flight westward, the slow disintegration of hope. Some stories end in triumph, others end in nobility, and some end simply because there's nothing left to tell. The survivors walked for 19 days, moving deeper into wilderness that even the Cherokee barely knew. They headed northwest, away from the soldiers, away from settlements, away from everything that resembled civilization. At night, Tayanita watched his warriors sleep and counted their wounds, both visible and invisible. They were down to 7. 7 men from a nation that had once numbered tens of thousands. 7 free Cherokee in all of Georgia, maybe in all the South. The youngest, Wire, had developed a fever from an infected gunshot wound in his shoulder. They had no medicine, no healer, nothing but stream water and hope. Each morning when he woke, Tayanita was surprised to find the boy still breathing. Each night he wondered if morning would come at all. On the 20th day, they found the village. It appeared like a mirage through morning fog, a small settlement of perhaps 40 Cherokee, hidden in a valley so remote that no white man had ever mapped it. Women were grinding corn outside simple cabins. Children were playing near a stream. An old man sat carving wood, his hands steady despite his age. They stared at the approaching warriors with a mixture of fear and wonder. Strangers were dangerous. Strangers meant soldiers might follow. But these were Cherokee, and hospitality was older than fear. The village elder, a woman named Ayita, who claimed to be 93 years old, invited them to her fire. She listened to their story without interruption, her ancient face impossible to read. When Tayanita finished speaking, she was silent for a long time. "You killed white men," she finally said. "Not a question, a statement. Yes, to save 5 slaves. To defend ourselves, to remind the world that we still exist. And you brought soldiers to our valley." "No, we made sure we weren't followed. Your people are safe." Ayita laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. "Safe? There is no safe, grandson. Not for Cherokee, not anymore. The world we knew is gone. The question now is whether we vanish completely or leave behind enough stories that our descendants will remember we existed." She gestured to the village around them. We've been here for 4 generations. My grandmother's grandmother found this place, claimed it was shown to her in a vision. We've hidden from every war, every removal, every attempt to destroy us. We thought we could wait out the storm." She shook her head sadly. "But storms don't pass anymore. They just grow stronger." "Then what do you do?" Wire asked, his voice weak with fever. "We do what we've always done. We survive. We adapt. We remember." She looked at Tyanita, "And sometimes, when necessary, we fight. Not to win. Winning is impossible, but to show that we were here, that we mattered, that we didn't go quietly." That night the village held a council. The discussion lasted hours, voices rising and falling, debating what the arrival of warriors meant, whether they should be sheltered or sent away, whether their actions had been heroic or suicidal. In the end, Ayita's voice carried the decision. They stay, they rest, they heal, and when they're ready, they'll tell us everything they've learned, every tactic they've used, every way they've survived. Because if soldiers ever find this valley, we'll need to know how to fight. Tyanita spent the next 3 weeks teaching. He showed the younger villagers how to move without sound, how to read tracks, how to set ambushes. He taught them which plants could poison, which streams ran cold enough to hide scent, which paths through the mountains might offer escape if escape became necessary. The older villagers taught him in return. They knew stories he'd never heard, songs he'd forgotten, traditions that had survived even when everything else had been destroyed. In those weeks, he felt something he hadn't felt since before the removal orders: connection, community. The sense that perhaps all was not lost, that fragments of Cherokee civilization might persist even in this remote valley, hidden from history, but not from memory. Waya recovered slowly, his fever breaking after 7 agonizing days. The village healer, a middle-aged woman named Adsila, had used poultices Tyanita didn't recognize, had sung prayers he'd never learned. When the boy finally woke clear-eyed and hungry, the entire village celebrated with a feast that depleted their stores, but lifted their spirits. "I dreamed," Waya told Tyanita one night as they sat by the stream. "I dreamed I saw the 5 people we saved. They were in a city I didn't recognize, surrounded by tall buildings, and they were free. Not just physically free, free in their souls. They'd forgotten what it felt like to be hunted." "It was just a dream," Tyanita said gently. "Maybe. But it felt real. It felt like proof that what we did mattered." Tyanita wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that their violence had been more than just rage, that it had accomplished something beyond adding more blood to soil already saturated with it. But he was old enough, had seen enough, to know that history was written by winners, and the Cherokee had lost every battle that mattered. Still, he let the boy believe. What else was there? On the 30th day, a scout returned with devastating news. Soldiers were in the area, not searching, not hunting, but surveying, marking boundaries for new settlement, drawing maps of land they planned to claim. They were 5 miles south, moving north, and eventually, inevitably, they would find the valley. The village erupted into panic debate. Some wanted to flee immediately, scatter into deeper wilderness. Others wanted to fight, to defend what was theirs. A few older voices suggested surrender, trying to negotiate safe passage west. Ayita listened to all of it, then spoke with the absolute authority of someone who'd survived 9 decades of tragedy. "We don't run. We don't fight. We vanish." She explained her plan. The village would be dismantled completely, every cabin burned, every field destroyed, every sign of habitation erased. The Cherokee would split into small groups, no more than 5 people per group, and scatter throughout the mountains. They would maintain no contact, establish no patterns. They would become myths, legends, ghosts that white men spoke of but never found. "We will cease to exist as a community," she said, "but we will continue as individuals. Our grandchildren may never meet each other. They may grow up speaking English, wearing white men's clothes, forgetting the old ways. But they will carry Cherokee blood, and blood remembers even when minds forget. It was surrender dressed in strategy, but it was also survival, and survival was all they had left. The dismantling took 3 days. Tyanita helped burn cabins his warriors had sheltered in, watched as fields were deliberately destroyed, as every trace of 4 generations was systematically erased. It felt like dying, like witnessing the death of something precious and irreplaceable. On the final night, before they scattered, the village gathered one last time. They sang old songs, told old stories, spoke old prayers. Children too young to understand what was happening played in the firelight, while elders wept silently, knowing they'd never see each other again. Ayita approached Tyanita as the fire burned low. "You'll go west," she said. "Try to find your son. Try to reach the lands where our people were forced to march." "Yes, you may not make it. The journey is long and you're being hunted. I know." She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light as bird bones. "What you did, saving those 5 souls, fighting the soldiers, standing when everyone else had fallen, it matters. Not because it changed the outcome, it didn't. We're still destroyed. But because somewhere in some future we can't imagine, people will hear your story and understand that not all Cherokee went quietly, that some of us fought, that some of us remembered what freedom meant." Tyanita felt tears on his face for the first time since his wife had died. "It doesn't feel like enough." "It never does," Ayita agreed, "but it's what we have. It's all we've ever had." By dawn, the valley was empty. The cabins were ash, the fields were scorched. 43 Cherokee had dissolved into the mountains like morning mist, carrying only what they could hide, becoming invisible, becoming myths. Tyanita and his 6 warriors headed west, following stars and rivers, and the faint hope that somewhere beyond the horizon their people still existed as a people and not just as scattered refugees. They never saw the village or each other again. 6 months later, Tyanita died in Oklahoma Territory, 2 days' walk from where his son had settled with survivors of the Trail of Tears. He'd made it farther than anyone had expected, through winter storms and militia patrols, and the endless exhaustion of being hunted. In the end, it wasn't violence that killed him, but simple age. His body finally surrendering to decades of loss. His remaining warriors buried him on a hill overlooking a river he'd never seen before, in soil his ancestors had never walked. They marked the grave with stones arranged in traditional patterns, then scattered, disappearing into history, becoming the kind of men who might be your neighbor, your blacksmith, your shopkeeper, never speaking of what they'd done, never revealing who they'd been. Wire survived. He found work on a farm, married a Cherokee woman who'd walked the entire Trail of Tears, had children who grew up speaking English and Cherokee in equal measure. He never told them about the slave patrol, the canyon battle, the village in the hidden valley. Those stories stayed locked in his heart until he was an old man, and even then he shared them only once with his oldest grandson, who listened with wide eyes and promised to remember. That grandson had children. Those children had children. By the time the 20th century arrived, the story had become fragmented, unclear, mixed with other legends and half-remembered truths. But it persisted. In Cherokee communities, in oral histories, in the kind of stories people tell when they want to remind themselves that their ancestors were more than victims. The 5 people Tyanita saved made it to Ohio in September 1838. The woman, whose name was Eliza, found work as a seamstress. The boy, named Samuel, learned to read and write, eventually becoming a teacher. The 3 men took different paths. One became a preacher, one a carpenter, one a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping others escape slavery just as he'd been helped. None of them ever knew the full story of what happened in that forest. They knew Cherokee warriors had saved them, had massacred their pursuers, had guided them north, But they didn't know about the battles that followed, the village that was erased, the price that was paid. In 1852, Eliza's daughter wrote a letter to an abolitionist newspaper describing her mother's escape. The letter mentioned Cherokee saviors who'd appeared like angels in the darkness. The newspaper printed it, and the story spread through abolitionist circles, becoming part of the larger narrative about resistance and humanity. In some versions, the Cherokee chief became a mythical figure, 10 feet tall, able to vanish into smoke, blessed by spirits. In others, he was more human, but no less heroic. The details varied, but the core remained. A man who'd chosen justice over safety, who'd saved lives at terrible cost, who'd proven that humanity could transcend the boundaries white men tried to impose. In Georgia, the massacre of the slave patrol became a cautionary tale. Plantation owners hired more guards, created larger patrols, instituted harsher punishments for attempted escapes. The governor commissioned an official report that portrayed Tayanita as a savage monster, a warning about what happened when Indians were allowed to remain on civilized land. But among the enslaved, the story took a different shape. It became a spiritual, sung in codes that overseers couldn't understand. It became a prayer, whispered by people who needed to believe that somewhere, someone had stood up for them. It became hope. The idea that the world contained more than just cruelty, that even in the darkest moments, humanity could shine through. Colonel Whitmore survived his wound, but never returned to military service. He lived another 12 years, dying of pneumonia in 1850. In his final delirium, witnesses reported that he kept speaking about a Cherokee chief asking forgiveness, though for what, no one could determine. Lieutenant Perkins, who'd also survived the Canyon battle, left the army entirely. He moved to Philadelphia, became a shopkeeper, married, had children. He never spoke publicly about what happened in that canyon, but his private journal, discovered after his death, contained a single entry about the events. We hunted men who wanted only to live free. We thought ourselves righteous. We thought ourselves civilized. Then we met others who showed us what civilization truly meant. I carry their faces with me still. I suspect I will carry them forever. The Etowah River still flows through Georgia, cold and clear, carrying its secrets. The clearing where Tayanita killed the slave patrol has been reclaimed by forest. No markers, no monuments, just trees and earth, and the endless cycle of growth and decay. The canyon where the battle happened is now part of a state park, though the interpretive signs make no mention of what occurred there. Hikers sometimes report feeling uneasy in that particular stretch, as if the land itself remembers. The hidden valley where the village once stood remains remote, visited occasionally by hunters or hikers who notice nothing unusual, just forest, just rocks, just the normal wilderness. But sometimes, if you know what to look for, you can find patterns in the stone arrangements, remnants of careful habitation, evidence that people once lived there who understood how to belong to land rather than own it. In 2015, a graduate student at the University of Georgia discovered a collection of letters in the state archives. They'd been misfiled, forgotten for over a century. One letter, written by a Cherokee woman in 1891, described her grandmother's stories about a village that vanished, about warriors who fought patrols, about a chief who'd saved 5 slaves and sparked a chain of events that still echoed generations later. The student published her findings in an obscure academic journal. The story gained little attention, just another forgotten piece of indigenous history, another reminder of what was lost. But the student sent a copy to the Cherokee Nation. They added it to their archives, included it in oral history projects, made sure it was preserved for future generations who might need to know that their ancestors had been heroes, not just victims. Tayanita never knew if what he did mattered. He died believing his people were destroyed, believing that nothing he'd done had changed the inevitable march of history, believing that the 5 lives he'd saved were drops of water in an ocean of suffering. He was wrong. Those 5 lives created families, communities, generations of free people who built schools and businesses and movements. Their descendants became activists, educators, artists, leaders. The chain reaction of that single act of mercy rippled forward through time in ways impossible to trace but impossible to deny. And the story itself, distorted, mythologized but fundamentally true, became part of the larger narrative about resistance, about humanity, about the complicated ways people of different nations found common cause against systems designed to dehumanize them all. The newspapers called it a massacre. The Runaways called it salvation. History would struggle to call it anything at all, preferring silence to complexity, erasure to acknowledgement. But the land remembers, the river remembers. And somewhere in the blood and memory of those who carry Cherokee heritage, who carry the heritage of enslaved Africans who fought for freedom, who carry the complicated history of America itself, somewhere in all of that, the story persists. Not as monument or memorial, not as official history or textbook narrative, but as truth. Difficult, uncomfortable, undeniable truth about what happened when empires collided, when systems of oppression intersected, when individuals had to choose between survival and principle. Tayanita chose principle. He died for it. His people were destroyed anyway, but he was right to choose it. That matters. Even when it doesn't change the outcome, it matters. The forest knows. The river knows. And now, in whatever small way a story can preserve what history tries to bury, we know too.